treasure, talent, ties, or testimony, giving any one of those for social good. Time and talent is obviously volunteering. Jess, I know you've talked a little bit about the time with that before. Treasure is, of course, treasure is, of course, money. Is that better? And then testimony, raising awareness, ties, providing more connections. And it's saying that the British public do this in spades. In fact, we're one of the leading countries for the amount of money that we give to charity as a percentage of GDP. And that is the bedrock of communities. That's the second part of this event that we're talking about. Because often when you talk about communities, what do you mean? It's people giving up their time, spending their time to create connections, create bonds, and work together to make a place or a topic better. And every Lib Dem politician I've seen elected over the last 14 years that I've been involved in politics has been elected saying they'll be a champion for communities. And now is the moment for that more than ever to be also championing philanthropy in all of those forms. Because we talk about the great things that philanthropy does, but philanthropy is also in crisis. We have seen a decade of decline in the number of people who give to charity. In the 2000s, a third of households gave regularly to charities. It's now less than a quarter. And that fall did start before COVID. The same with volunteering. In 2013, 45% of the English population volunteered at least annually. That's now 27%. And I think we also have to think about this in the form of another T, which is trust. If people are not giving their time. So restoring philanthropy to strengthen our communities, I think could and perhaps should be a key plank of Lib Dem policy going forwards. It should be core to what we try and achieve with this huge new cohort that the Lib Dems have. Because communities are core to what Lib Dems do, and philanthropy is core to making sure they grow again. That was a really good reality check, is that when you've heard so many great examples, to remember that we are in crisis as a philanthropic sector it's really important, and we'll come back to that point as well. I wanted to start back to Donna. I've got a few questions for the panel, and then I'm going to open it up to the room as well. But Donna, I wanted to come back to you to say, what do you need, like in the charitable sector, to do your job well, to work with philanthropy better? What do you need?
Yeah, okay. So what do we need? We need people to trust us, and I think people trust the charity sector better than they trust the government. It's being spent in the right way. I think generally what charities need is support. We don't receive any statutory funding, but we work with an awful lot of organisations that do receive statutory funding. And because we are a partner organisation, so people come into the Children's Hospital, they get treated by our doctors and nurses, and then they're back out into the community. A lot of the work that we do is then linking them up with other charities in the sector that can help them with whatever condition or whatever situation meant that they came to the hospital. And a lot of the charities that we're working with then are talking about how disconnected young people and children and communities are, that they don't know where to turn to help, or that the charities that they have turned to help in the past no longer exist because charities are folding and people haven't got enough money. We hear all the time about charities that we used to refer to that now don't exist. So I think charities need more help in order to be able to connect with other organisations. I know you talked about there being lots and lots of organisations, but actually, for example, tendering processes are much easier to go through if you're a massive organisation. And what that means is that larger organisations tend to cannibalise smaller organisations that are doing really specific pieces of work. And so those really brilliant small organisations that are doing really specific things with a very specific cohort of people are unable to survive because they can't get through the tender process, whether that's for the council or whether that's for NHS money. So I think there needs to be support for smaller organisations. A lot of the ways that the charity sector is set up really favour massive organisations. And I know I was introduced as a large organisation with just about £1 million. So for me, that's not a large charity at all. We're a really small organisation that we support 300,000 kids. But there are loads and loads of organisations that are much smaller than us that are really struggling because the world favours the larger charities.
And thinking about where that help can come from to help piece together the sector and kind of join the gaps in the sector, which I imagine is particularly important when you can't rely on the state for anything. And if these things are becoming embedded in each other, making sure the system joins up is incredibly important. Is that a role for government, for charities, for philanthropic givers, like we heard from Lisa as well, or everyone?
I think it comes from all three, actually, and some of the best groups and networks come from all of those. So we have council organisations that bring charities together to try and solve problems. They're really brilliant. I think anything that you can do to bring charities together to talk about issues is great. We have networking partners where companies bring those organisations together because they're particularly interested. That usually is very helpful because it comes with money at the same time. Usually the council doesn't give us money to come together, and that can be really difficult. A lot of the work where charities are asked to input into things or come along as experts then doesn't have any money attached to it. And actually there's only so much of that turning up and talking about stuff that a charity can afford to do. And again, it favours really big organisations that have the resources that can send out people to go and talk and be in those communities. Smaller organisations don't have the capacity or the people to keep going to those networking, bringing forward type discussions.
We're already getting to quite a practical place. It's really, really great. I'm interested to hear about how at each level, from local community groups to philanthropic givers to what government can do, how they need to behave differently to unlock philanthropic giving and the impact for local communities. So I'm thinking in your experience of coordinating locally, how do communities work together in the most optimal way to release that kind of capital and that togetherness that can have the impact that you had during the pandemic?
I think the example that I use with my volunteer organisation was so unique because people were seeking out a way to help.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily know that my example is the fix, because my example is we could have another pandemic, and I don't think that's the answer. I think the issue is that some of our smaller community-based charities form because they are passionate about a specific area and they do not live in the circles where the money exists. And it's understanding how they can get access to those people. I met a charity that's now embarking on a huge project. It's going to potentially cost £4 million to build a bespoke unit. They've never dealt with money in this sense, and they were saying, we were thinking we might host a ball and invite all of the parents that engage with us and charge for tickets, and I was saying, and how many hours of work are you going to put into this? And, oh, it's going to take us months, and how much are you going to earn at the end of it? Oh, and they can reel off a few £1,000s when actually what they need is a dinner with 6 people from their community. But how do they get access to them? And I think that's where we need the unlocking. That's where we need to utilise MPs and to utilise people that have those positions of, well, actually, I visited, that charity and I visited that charity, and you're all trying to do the same thing. So why don't I put you all in a room together and you can share your list of people that are currently supporting you? Because the person that's giving to the charity that's supporting young people's mental health might also be really interested in what's happening over here with school refusers, or, when you're doing similar things. So I don't think my example is the answer of a pandemic. I think it's about making the right connections and having somebody that can do that for them.
And having that role of social connectors within the community who are people who become MPs or MPs themselves, but you need more capacity to do it at the scale, I imagine.
And also, I think we're all in a very unique position in this room where we've all gone through a general election, and anybody that was involved in that general election has played a part in fundraising. Because how do you do a big general election? You need people to give. And so I think I don't know, I can't speak for Josh and Lisa, but I have found that an uncomfortable experience, asking people to give. But when you lay out, I need it for a specific thing, and you find those people that are willing to support, they may also be willing to support others.
Brilliant. I wanted to come back to Lisa's comment, ego and philanthropic kind of behaviours. Like, what needs to change there? What kind of behaviours is ego driving in giving, and what needs to change?
So I'm going to combine that question with the point about the amount it costs to contribute. When people are thinking about how can we do this better, asking people to give up half a day of their time is really expensive and it's a really big ask. So I think when we're asking people for something, when we're asking small organisations for something, paying for their travel, making sure they get something from it, paying for their time, then enables them to meaningfully contribute, and you will get much more from it. So that's something, as a director of JRRT, one of our missions is to strengthen the hand of those people doing stuff. And you can only do that if you get the right people in the room. And so I think that's really important. I think the other thing that's important is working out what people actually need, and would paying for a fundraising expert, so people coming asking for or applying for a grant. The grant's maybe not ready to be given, but actually some fundraising support, 5 days of fundraising support might be hugely meaningful for a small organisation that's doing really impactful work, but they're not fundraising experts, but actually just helping them work out their case for support would be really useful. I think the networking with other funders is where I'm going to bring in the ego point. And that is something philanthropists can do. It is something other charities can do. And there's a great example in Stockport, which is my patch, called Sector 3, which is a charity itself. And it's doing some of that convening, some of that networking, and helping people with the never-ending conveyor belt of having to apply for grants, and streamlining some of those processes so you don't have to start with a blank piece of paper every time. But it's doing things as a philanthropist, thinking, how can I help? Well, I can introduce you to people. If I'm giving, some of my friends might also give. And getting these people in a room, because this is a cause I believe in, that is a lovely way to keep you in again, isn't it? And it involves no plaques on walls. It involves naming no wings of galleries, but it is hosting a dinner with like-minded people for a cause, whether that's to elect Jess Brown-Fuller as the phenomenal member of Parliament for Chichester,
or Milton Keynes,
or indeed Milton Keynes, wherever it was, Milton Keynes Central. I'm sure you'd be excellent, but probably better for Chichester. Yes. So I think that ego, it's about why people are giving, and it's about what people want to achieve. And some people want to be something. The best people want to do something, and so it's how do we empower those people to do something.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to come to questions. One last one from me for the panel, which is coming back to this idea of the crisis of philanthropy. But what can government do to ease that crisis, support the sector through that crisis? I'll come back to Nicole on that, and then Josh.
Yeah, I mean, Josh did list. We sort of say that government has 6 roles in this, of which Josh had 3 of them. So that convening role, that leveraging role, and that funder role. They also have a role in making good data available. In terms of that trust point, that's really important for a lot of philanthropists, being able to have good data on charities. They obviously have power over regulation and guidance, and there's definitely regulation and guidance that stops major donors from giving, particularly from abroad. And they do have that championing role if you want to touch the ego live wire. There is, I think, 3 really big things that the charity sector is asking for, particularly from the current government. Which is how can it use match funding better? It's going to put together a load of funds for various social issues throughout the course of this 5 years. How can it also work with philanthropists to raise money? Match funding is an incredibly powerful leverage tool. The second is that point that Jess made around sort of capacity. How can we make it easier to give? We know that we want wealthy people to give. They have more to give, and they say that they can afford to give. About £2.8 billion a year more, we reckon they can give. They are all, half of wealthy people talk to a financial advisor. How can financial advisors be playing a role to support their clients to give? That would be a free change that the government could make. Yes, they'd have to pay slightly more in gift aid, but otherwise a pretty cheap change that would drive potentially hundreds of millions of pounds into the charity sector at a stroke. And then what it can do in places. And we've had a bit of a conversation about that, about how you can grow capacity in places. Yes, there's a role for local politicians. There's also a role for local charitable infrastructure, places like community foundations, but also places like your Charity 3 that you were just talking about. Local charitable infrastructure, about 20% fewer organisations than there were in 2010. Huge decline because the current cuts to local government. If we can restore that, the government has currently commissioned a review into that we hope it will act on. I think that will make a huge amount of difference, because you can do that convening, but you can also do that sort of, helping train fundraisers, helping grow that capacity in place. Those are our top 3 asks.
Fantastic, thank you. Josh?
Yeah, I'm going to be cheeky and come in on another one of the earlier points, only because in my intro I listed a bunch of things that I thought government could do. So, I mean, first of all, and I keep pushing this point, philanthropy is one thing, but I think that trading is critical for sustainability. If a charity or a social enterprise can find a means of generating that another income stream to diversify where it's getting its money from, it becomes more resilient to shocks, whether it's in the grant funding world or elsewhere. And I think the point that Donna was making actually feeds into this around the capacity of community and voluntary sector organisations to enter procurement processes. I think that the third sector, its ability to deliver on many of these contracts is awesome, but the know-how to secure them in the first place is like part of the gap. And that's why when I was at the School for Social Entrepreneurs, I introduced a program, a procurement readiness program, to support charities and social enterprises to understand what's in this black box of tendering and procurement, whether it's with big private companies or whether it is with local authorities, so that they were in a better position to embark on this. And even further, what we kind of ascertained was that still we needed that there was still more of a missing middle. And one of the things was when it came to the delivery of the program, of the contracts, some organisations were too small to deliver on what needed to be delivered. And so we created another program where we supported organisations to kind of band together to create consortia and do joint bids for contracts. And a number of the organisations that went through that successfully secured those. So check out the Bruin Delta Procurement Readiness Programme that I introduced. And then in terms of, I was really interested in this point around the ego. And I think that we need to do more to strip ego out of the grant giving world. And I think that there are kind of 3 interesting means of doing that. First of all, I think that we need to look at who is it that is giving out the grants in trusts and foundations, who are reviewing the applications. You often have amazing grants officers, but really interesting piece of research was done by 10 Years' Time a little while ago, not 10 years ago, and they found that the grant giving sector could do with a lot more diversity. So they developed a 2027 programme to support people from underrepresented or underestimated backgrounds to become grant officers, with a view to some of that cash being distributed in a more equitable way. And I think that's one way of stripping some ego out of the grant giving world. I mean, another thing as well is incorporating lived experience into the review of grant applications. So some of the folks who stand to benefit from the funding, whether it's charities and social enterprises directly, or whether it's some of the people that they work with to be part of those assessments, I think is really important. Secondly, in terms of stripping out the ego, I mean, I was fascinated, and my head is still kind of buzzing from it, by what Lankelly Chase announced a couple of years back. For those of you who aren't familiar, Lankelly Chase, massive grant giver in this space, particularly around kind of system change. And what they said a couple of years ago is, guys, we have thought a lot, and we feel that there are a number of kind of colonial discomforts within the traditional grant giving space that we just can't reconcile with the impact we want to have. So we are going to shut down and we are going to distribute our endowment to organisations that are specifically aiming to try to beat a number of these systemic barriers that are kind of fostering some of the inequalities that the grant cash would otherwise go to funds. Now, that is a huge de-egoing of grant funding, and I think, not for every foundation necessarily, but a really exciting approach to it. And third, in terms of stripping the ego out, something I'm particularly passionate about, participatory budgeting. Some of you who were at the CSJ panel might have heard me speak about this. As Liberals, I think many of us can agree that cash is best dispensed and spent when it's done closest to the individuals and communities who stand to benefit from it. And participatory budgeting is one means of that. Giving individuals a say over how that cash is spent. We trialled this in Eastbourne a few years ago, where we led a process to declare a cost of living emergency and unlocked £250,000 in grant funding to support organisations battling the cost of living. And one of the things I said is that I only want this to happen if it can be the community that decides how this is spent. So I ran a cost of living emergency summit. I brought Citizens Advice Bureau, food banks, churches, businesses, schools, all sorts into a room together and said, guys, what are the key cost of living needs that exist in our town, in your words, based on your insights? Captured them, and almost word for word, I translated those insights into what became the grant criteria for that cost of living fund, which was then allocated accordingly. And as a result, we set up, for example, one of the UK's first warm space networks that many organisations or many towns and cities adopted over the months that followed as well, and generated really positive social impact outcomes, way better than what could have been envisaged by some very well-meaning but ivory-towered bureaucrats in the council building. So I think there's lots of things that we can do to bring grant funding closer to the communities who it stands and must serve, but we've got to pair that as well with sustainable forms of funding by building capacity to secure contracts and generate income as well.
I'm going to come back to reflections at the end of the panel, if that's okay. Is there anything you want to come in on now before we go to questions for the floor?
Yeah, just a couple of things, if I may. I think one of the things that we need to recognise when we are talking about philanthropy, I think the points about plaques and egos are really well made. But certainly, we as an organisation are privileged to work with an awful lot of donors who don't. They've left their ego, and actually, society need to find an appropriate way to recognise the reality about plaques and egos, because that's part of the mix. Put it in a sense of perspective. And I almost feel that the word philanthropy has become associated with some of those negative connotations, when if you actually unpack it, the Greek origins of philanthropy is a love of humanity. And what motivates most people who give extraordinary amounts of money is fundamentally that love of humanity as opposed to their ego. And I think it's important that we keep sight of that.
Thank you. So I can see hands going up. I'm going to take 3 and direct them to the panel, and then hopefully we'll have time for 2 rounds. This gentleman here.
Thank you. I'm Alan Fox from Leicester. I live in South Highfields, which is one of the most deprived neighbourhoods in the country. And we found as a local community that if we're very clear about what the problem is, and we work out a way of dealing with it that doesn't add any bells and whistles, because we don't have premises, we don't have paid staff. We have funders falling over themselves to give us money to solve that problem. And I think that the question that's been asked in the time of this session has been put the wrong way around. And I think Josh and Jess have both sort of begun to answer the question I want to ask, which is how do we enable local communities to get that sort of self-confidence that they can present what needs to happen in their communities to people who have money and who would like to give it to them if only they were asked.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take the gentleman at the front here and then right at the back as well. Sorry, just to make Julian run.
Cheers, thank you very much. From Corporate UK, National Federation for Co-ops. I'm really curious to talk about egos and how you leveraging money. We haven't talked about community benefit societies as a model that can obviously be charitable and they can have charitable exempt status, but they can obviously access withdrawable non-transferable share capital or community shares. So they can actually leverage in capital in from investors on small return rates, but they also leverage in that important thing, which is community engagement and membership participation inside the organisation. So I'm wondering, panel's thoughts on how we actually further unlock that kind of community-based capital to actually grow community businesses.
Thank you. And right at the back there. Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Dr. David Willingham, Shelton. My question is, how do we get over the legal force of which we can't make it big? So I have money as a councillor for local organisations. I can engage with them via letter, personal visit, social media. There is a form they need to fill in and return. We still have money after 3.5 years. So how do you get people to bid?
Wow, there's a real reality check in that as well. Jess, do you want to take the question on how do we enable local communities? Yeah. Okay, so we're going to Jess first.
Thank you for the question. And actually, at the heart of that, it's how do we re-establish communities? Because I think we have a crisis across the entire country where people have lost their sense of belonging, and they feel like they've lost ownership of their community, their space, the people that they share their lives with on a larger scale. And how do we bring that back? For me, it's through the cultural sector. I was the chair of a music, arts and drama festival for 5 years, and when I took that over, it was achieving lovely things for middle class people. And it was a fantastic festival, and it was not engaging with the wider community. And so I flipped it on its head, and I said our priorities are now those that don't have access to music, arts and drama. I want to focus on the kids that don't ever get to go and see a show in a theatre. I want to get the parents who aren't going out for evenings out. I want to get those